Right. And I'm not sure, because I think that those slides are actually Contain's, and I'm just not sure if his connection is working so well. But just to say that the agenda for today will be two recent kind of discussions that have new products, I guess, from them. So we have colleagues from STOPAIDS actually in the room with me who are going to be presenting on the launch of the Principles for Meaningful Involvement of Civil Society and Communities in Global Health Governance, which was launched just last week, even though it already feels like ages ago. We're here in Berlin at colleagues' offices, where we've been sitting and strategizing and just refreshing our minds about what we heard and what we talked about over the last few days, and how that sort of so much of it seems to revolve around the meaningful inclusion of civil society and communities. So we're going to hear from, I think, Mike Podmore about that, and that really briefly, and a lot of that information is online, and we'll share all of those links. And then we're going to hear from Claudia Ahumada at the Global Fund, who's going to be speaking to us about the advocacy roadmap that was published and shared over GFAN just a few weeks ago. We'll speak a little bit more to it towards the end of the call, but as a reminder, this is sort of the first of two calls, at least for the GFAN kind of broader community. Today's call, and then there's a call being hosted tomorrow by the delegations to the Global Fund Board, as well as some key population network representatives who are going to be, I think, with Claudia, diving into a little bit more of some of the details. So if what you hear today whets your appetite, then please make sure to join that call tomorrow, which I believe is at the same time, but we'll share those details again over GFAN. So I'm going to be calling on STOPAIDS. I think, Conte, you're back with us. We've started to record the call, and we're just going to pass it over to Mike from STOPAIDS to give us a little bit of an overview about the launch and the principles themselves. So, Mike, if I could pass it over to you, to my left.
Yes, thanks, Katie. Hi, everybody. What I was just really wanted to sort of to talk you through briefly was we had the sort of global launch of the Principles of Meaningful Involvement of Communities and Civil Society in Global Health Governance. That was last Thursday, and some of you may have been able to join that call. These are a sort of set of principles that have been developed over a number of years by a group of sort of partner organizations, sort of facilitating working with the society and community delegations to the boards of all the GHIs, the Global Health Initiatives. I'm just going to drop in the chat there. The website is there. These principles are all up there, and please do go and have a look at those. And the recording of the launch, which goes into all the principles in a lot more detail, with all the presentations, is there, so you can watch that and find out more about the principles and sign up. And I'll come on to the next steps just at the end. But the principles really are, as I mentioned, sort of the work of over a number of years. Really came out of both thinking about what are the lessons from particularly the HIV movement, and how those some of the positive lessons around meaningful involvement could be brought to sort of broader health and universal health coverage. And there was a paper produced by a number of partners in 2020 around that on HIV, UHC, and the global health architecture. And then following that, did sort of worked with a number of partners and the delegations, doing a number of global and regional consultations to sort of consult on what might be some of the principles that we all sort of collectively believe will actually manifest meaningful involvement in global health governance. There was a task team of the delegations, as I said, that sort of convened and led this process over the course of the last year or so, and the principles that have now been published are sort of a working set of principles. They are live, and they're very much intending that we are going to be sort of, we'll welcome feedback on them, additions, changes, etc. And so it will be sort of, there's an opportunity to sort of feedback to those. I'll now maybe just say what the principles are. They're very much focused on a meaningful involvement in global health governance, in global health institutions in particular, sort of drawing on the experience from across the different global health institutions already. The principles sort of cite examples of good practice from lots of different institutions: Global Fund, UNITAID, Gavi, GFF, UNAIDS, STOPTP, Partnership, etc. So please do check those out. Now, to what are the principles? The principles, there are 4 that are targeted particularly to global health institutions and their key stakeholders. The first of those 4 is that communities and civil society are represented in decision-making structures with a permanent role and equal voting, or sort of equity in voting is sort of across the governing board. It's very important that sorry, I've just been told that maybe you can't hear me very loudly. Sort of good practice we've sort of seen in a number of institutions is that affected communities have their own seat and vote, and civil society also have their own seats and votes. And there are examples, obviously, where there's in the Global Fund, where there's developed country NGO and developing country NGOs have 2 separate seats. The second principle is that governance support is provided for governance roles and to facilitate broader civil society and community engagement. And this is really that there needs to be, support from the institution, both with, dedicated staff. There might be sort of all types of sort of support, ensuring that their delegations receive the documentation they need with enough time to consult, and that there's thinking about what the dynamics on the board are that really ensure that civil society and communities can play a strong and meaningful role. The third principle is that funding is provided for governance roles and to facilitate broader civil society and community engagement. And this is really that obviously the board members themselves are supported to engage, but crucially that there is funding for a broader constituency or delegation, so that there are sort of a broader set of individuals who can support the member, but also that they can be actively consulting and seeking to get inputs from the whole constituency, the whole sort of across the world who they might be representing. The fourth principle is that civil society and communities design and lead their own selection processes for their board members and constituencies, which reflects the diversity, knowledge, and experience of their constituencies and the work of the institution. Too often, unfortunately, what we've seen is that global health institutions sometimes think that they should be the ones who should be selecting which civil society sits on their board. And what this principle is clearly saying is that civil society and communities need to be the ones running those processes in an open, transparent way. And really sort of trying to ensure that they, represent the diversity of the different constituents. So those are the 4 principles for global health institutions, but crucially, we also have a principle that is directed for civil society and communities ourselves. And that is that that principle is that civil society and community representatives are transparent and accountable, and that it's seeking to understand and represent the perspectives and priorities of their constituencies. And this is really important, that we are holding ourselves to the highest standard possible, that we are as representatives, that we are truly sort of seeking to represent the full diversity of the constituencies that we represent, and in particular that we are seeking to ensure that there's a voice for the most marginalized and those who might not otherwise have a voice in global decision making. So these are the 5 principles. Really encourage you to sort of have a look at those to give us, give feedback. And the next steps really, and you can endorse them, and we hope that you will all endorse them as your organizations and sort of share them widely. Now, each of the delegations of all the global health institutions will be picking up discussions about these principles with their institution colleagues, with the secretariats. And we hope to produce a scorecard that will be sort of seeing how these different global institutions are doing in relation to the principles. It's just the start, obviously. There's, I think, a need to really sort of thinking about what meaningful involvement principles and sort of gathering the great work that's already been done on meaningful involvement at other levels, at national level, regional level, and in other sort of processes and fora. But hopefully this is a helpful start to sort of seek to establish some global norms, crucially so that, the established process of including civil society and communities that we've seen in a number of key global institutions is maintained, and that when new institutions are created, that we don't have to fight the battle for civil society and communities to be involved, and that it's just taken as automatic. Anyway, I will stop there because I've probably taken more time than I should have done. But thanks very much and welcome your feedback.
Thanks, Mike. I think that's really helpful, a really helpful overview. And we popped into the chat the link to the webpage, as well as just to mention that we've been tweeting about this, so you can go and grab our tweets on this, as well as, all of the other information to look at this and consider endorsing these principles yourselves as organizations. So I just wanted to open it up and see if there were any questions about this from colleagues. Sorry. Sonal, I see your hand raised. If there's others who would like to jump in, please raise your hand or put it in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on both of those. Welcome, Sonal, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, thank you so much. Mike, I think fantastic. I love the 4 principles, and I love the one you also kept for civil society. And I was just thinking, if there is any scope of adding one more for civil society, and just saying that we have so many civil society members, and it would be good if we same people don't repeat in too many groups, because we have seen in past that has happened. I will be in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the boards. So if you can self-regulate to ensure that as many people get opportunities as possible, or something like that. I think that's good. But otherwise, I think this is great, and maybe we should push for it to become a kind of globally acceptable principles. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your feedback, Sonal. And actually, I think that's a great suggestion and addition. Funnily enough, it was something that we were just discussing around, really sort of trying to see whether. I think the crucial thing here is that it can seem such a jump to go into some of these positions, and so once you've been doing it, you're like, oh yes, okay, land up doing it quite a lot. But I think creating a sort of a very active mentorship program that's really and consciously sort of bringing in new voices, new perspectives is fundamental. So yeah, I think that could be a really helpful addition. Thanks.
Thank you, Sonal. Any other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any in the chat. And as Mike said, this is kind of, a start of a process. So, adding things as we go along, and also finding other ways that we can promote these principles, is certainly open. And there's a feedback form on the website, so feel free to use that. I see one more hand raised, so I'm going to take that and then move us on to our next section with the Secretariat and the Advocacy Roadmap. I'm sorry, I'm not sure who's sitting behind Minara's. Go ahead.
Eliarash from Minara, from Lebanon. I was checking the endorsements section, And it seems that you asked us to, if we want to give a feedback or if we want to endorse. My question is, how can we endorse, and what this will entitle for us? What will be our engagement that you're asking for? Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think my colleague Courtney is going to answer that. So it says, yeah.
Thanks so much. Yeah, sorry, we're in the same room. Just to come in. Yeah, so the feedback form is available on the website. If you do want to sort of share any thoughts on what's sort of in those principles. In terms of endorsement, what I'll do is I will pop an email into the chat just for now, just so that you can email, because then we add the logo on, and that's not quite available on the website at the minute. So I can do that. And just in terms of endorsement, it is more just sort of saying, obviously, that your organization supports it, those kind of principles. And obviously, we will make sure we have your contact details so we can keep you updated on next steps through that as well. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I think that's really helpful. Pop that into the chat. Just a friendly reminder to make sure that, excuse me, you keep your microphone on mute, whether you're in a car or wherever you might be, to make sure that there's as little background noise as possible. Thank you. And then I'd just like to invite Claudia Almada from the Global Fund Secretariat. I think, Claudia, that you've brought your own slides and we're going to be showing them today. Is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay. It sounds like we've all got like that frog in our throats today. Hopefully it's something more serious than that. But welcome, Claudia. And please, we're all, very interested to hear from you around the advocacy roadmap, the first, I think, of its kind, or at least in a long time from the Secretariat. So please welcome and go ahead.
Thank you. My voice is a little bit weak, but I've been saving it for this call because that's how excited I am to share this with you all. So Katie is right. This is the first, not in a long time, the first ever external looking advocacy roadmap that the Global Fund has ever developed. And I mean, that's significant for a number of reasons. I always, when I talk about the advocacy roadmap, I say this is our first external one, because of course, over the years, there have been a number of advocacy approaches, priorities, kind of light strategies developed internally that guide the way advocacy is done, but it had never been really put together systematically in a way that is consultative, engaging, and that is shared with partners. So just as a means of increasing our transparency with partners, we're really excited to have this. Essentially, we've been developing it throughout the year in consultation with many of you, and then also with internal teams across the Secretariat. And what's exciting about the roadmap is that for the first time, the Global Fund Secretariat is setting out, these are the 4 things that we are going to prioritize for advocacy, and this is why. And the reason why we thought we needed to develop an advocacy roadmap was in part because the context is shifting so much now. And we talk a lot in the Global Fund and across partners about how civil society space is shrinking, how there's this massive rollback and attack on human rights, how things are just getting harder and harder and harder. And what that led us to think is, well, so what is the responsibility of the Global Fund and the advocacy that we do in that context? And really saying we need to move beyond saying, yes, civil society space is shrinking. Yes, how terrible that is. Yes, we stand with civil society, but actually really proactively look, okay, what's the evidence around this? Why does it matter? And what do we commit to do as the Global Fund to do this? And through this process, we landed on 4 objectives, and I'm going to take you through all of them. But essentially, the first one is around strengthening leadership engagement and funding of communities of civil society. And that's, I mean, I'll take you through the actions, but that's big. There are commitments in there around meaningful engagement that link really nicely to what Mike was saying about the principles for communities and civil society engagement, but then also funding. Where of course the Global Fund does provide funding to civil society, my own team does, But what we're seeking to do with this objective is really just up the transparency around what kind of opportunities are available, who can access them, when, how, etc. Then the second objective is around mobilizing increased financial support for HIV, TB, and malaria in partnership with communities and civil society. In a nutshell, this is the replenishment objective. It's really around institutionalizing the engagement of communities and civil society in our resource mobilization efforts. Here, the actions are really things that we have done over the past years already, but there is a power now in putting it out there officially that we commit to do this. So then, in a way, it becomes less dependent on the people that happen to be in certain positions at a time, and it has to be there. We have said we will do it. So we've put in actions there around the partnership with GFAN, the partnership with Friends of the Global Fund, and others. Then the third objective is around increasing political support for these three diseases, while drawing linkages to other issues. And the two that really jump out here are pandemic preparedness and climate justice. This is really the keeping the issues on the agenda and showing the continued relevance. And how do we do that in a way that is strategic and cohesive together? And then last but not least, fourth objective is leveraging the Global Fund's diplomatic voice. So essentially, what will the Global Fund commit to do in the face of human rights violations and other acts that threaten gender equality, human rights, and equity? And this is a big one. Okay, I'm going to take you through it in a little bit more detail in a bit. But essentially, for the first objective, we really focused on the leadership engagement and funding of civil society, because what we saw, and we used here the data from Civicus, is that in the grand majority of countries where the Global Fund supports programs, the civic space is closed or restricted. And what we saw is that trend is increasing now, so it's getting more and more like that. Then at the same time, we did something that I personally am a big fan of. You'll see it here in the big red bubble. We contrasted the data on the openness or restricted civil society space against the disease burden. And what we got isn't entirely surprising, but it's so powerful to see it in numbers, because essentially, where civic space is closed or repressed, the disease burden is sometimes over 80%, no? Whereas in the few Global Fund countries, Global Fund supported countries, where civic space is open, where civil society is free to organize and advocate, the disease burden is less than 1%. And these numbers, they're so powerful, because I know that for all of us working in advocacy, we rarely get a week where someone doesn't question, oh, and what's the value of advocacy? And what's the real impact? And can you show me what you achieve? No, and these numbers are ones that I hope we can all use to say, well, it's not a coincidence that there is this massive correlation between disease burden and civic space. Now, what we're actually going to seek to achieve through this objective is strengthening partnerships with key community and civil society organizations and networks, really focusing on those living with and affected by the three diseases. And it was interesting to come to this outcome, because essentially a lot of the discussions within the Global Fund Secretariat, and particularly external relations over the past years, have been around how do we build new partnerships now? How do we branch out to pandemic preparedness? How do we link to climate? And it's important. We still want to do that. But we came to the realization also that we risk neglecting the communities that are really the reason why the Global Fund even exists, and are at the heart of everything we should be doing, because these movements, the movements of people living with HIV, those affected with TB and malaria, have evolved over the years too. So we really have some actions here that seek to not take, one, those partnerships for granted, but two, to work with them and support them to sustain their movement. Then as a second outcome here, we have the bridge building. And this is really about how do we connect the dots between organizations and how do we facilitate or fund or in other ways support connecting between different community groups. And this may be between key populations and youth, it may be between women's rights and LGBT, you name it. The concrete bridge building will really depend on the needs that we're hearing from you, but there's a commitment there to facilitate that. Then third, community-led and civil society organizations have the resources necessary to do their work. And this is a big one, no, because essentially what we're saying is the Global Fund is making a commitment to provide more resources to sustain the advocacy of community and civil society organizations. And this, I mean, for everyone that works with communities and civil society, we know we're always operating on shoestring budgets. And what we've found over the years is that funding is getting harder and harder for many civil society groups that were already marginalized, like key populations, are of course facing even greater challenges. But then add to that, that funding for advocacy also is very, very, very difficult to access. So the action that corresponds to this outcome is essentially a commitment for the budget of my team, political and civil society advocacy, to be in its grand majority dedicated to civil society and communities advocacy. This is something we've been doing already for the past 2 years or so. But the shift is, one, we've got an external commitment now. It needs to be that way. We've said we will continue to do it. And then the second shift that's important to know here, and we'll share more information on the GFAN listserv as it becomes available, is that we're going to move towards doing more transparent competitive bidding to access funding, because the way it has been so far is essentially we give to certain partners that are kind of partners that we know well. Other partners may ask us for funding because they happen to, be close enough to the Secretariat to know that there's some funding that may be available. And others really just have no way of knowing. So we want to shift that. We want to move towards being much more transparent about what can and can't be accessed, and we'll be doing different requests for proposals that address that gap. Then, so that's objective one, essentially everything engagement, leadership, funding. The second objective is around resource mobilization for the 3 diseases. And what we commit to here is building on our past experiences of engaging with civil society and communities, continuing to recognize here and draw on the leadership of the GFAN family and Friends of the Global Fund, while also making a concerted effort to bring in more meaningful engagement of key populations and young people, among others. And the other key action here to be aware of is that we plan to organize a series of dialogues between communities and private sector partners, because we realize that the amount of funds that we will be able to provide for advocacy is necessarily limited. But what the Global Fund can do is use its weight to essentially open doors for civil society to connect and access funding through the private sector and philanthropy. Then our third objective here is around linking. And linking between the 3 diseases, pandemic preparedness, climate change, and others. And what we want to do here is really just keep a close eye on the different negotiations in these other areas, so that we can bring in the health linkages, but also work with civil society and community partners. So you are helping to guide us now in terms of what's important, which are the linkages that we want to invest in. We realize we can't do everything at the same time, or at least certainly we can't do it well. And then at the same time, we want to help support partners to become more knowledgeable in these areas if it's something of interest. Then last but not least, we have an objective on the use of the Global Fund's diplomatic voice. I always remember that the Global Fund strategy uses the term diplomatic voice 31 times, and yet no one's quite sure what it is. No. In my mind, one of the things that it is about advocacy, which can be, of course, done in different ways, sometimes more overtly, sometimes more kind of hallway diplomacy and so on. But what we are sure about is that we are seeing really just a massive rollback and threat to human rights, to LGBTQ rights, sex workers, drug users, women's rights. It's really, really alarming. And what we seek to do through the roadmap is essentially set out sort of minimum expectations. So what can you expect the Global Fund to do in relation to these threats? And I call them minimum standards, even though we don't use that language in the roadmap, because I have high hopes that through putting in these principles in the roadmap, we will be able to facilitate and push discussions within the Global Fund Secretariat to do even more than this. But this is a start. This is more than we've had before. So essentially, what can you count on the Global Fund doing when it comes to that rollback of human rights? So one, to clearly and consistently communicate the Global Fund values in this regard, to use messaging and speak out against the impacts of those harmful laws that violate human rights and dignity. Then also to report publicly on actions taken to advance human rights and gender equality. And this is a big one, actually, because we haven't necessarily done that in the way that we're proposing in the roadmap before. And then, of course, it's not here on the slide, but we also have a commitment to actually consistently engage with communities on the ground that are affected by the different rollback of rights, so that we follow their guidance in each of the situations in recognition that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. Now, how are we actually going to use this? I love the roadmap. I really do, because we've never had anything like it before. The discussions to kind of get to agreement on it, both internally and externally, were massive, and they really helped us advance our own thinking of the role that the Global Fund has in terms of being accountable to how the advocacy ecosystem is changing. And if we say, which we do, that civil society and communities are at the heart of what we do, then okay, how does the Global Fund need to step up and support communities and civil society when things are so dire? That said, a document is only a document unless you use it. So I really, really encourage you all to use it as an accountability tool, to look at the actions under the areas that are most relevant to you and your work, and call us out on them, hold us accountable to the commitments that are there. From within my team, we will coordinate with and work in collaboration with other teams across the Global Fund Secretariat to implement it. It's an initiative that is very much spearheaded by my team, but we are fully cognizant that we cannot do it alone. So we worked with many teams across the Secretariat, grant management, the Community Rights and Gender, CCM Hub, and many, many more to develop it. Then we are also committing to report annually on the implementation on the advocacy roadmap. And what we want to do in those annual reports is have virtual briefings where, instead of just focusing on what went well and kind of celebrating, yes, we did A, B, and C, we want to focus on what didn't go well, no, and where we need to come together and jointly strategize to achieve progress in the areas that were not as successful as one would hope, because I think the advocacy roadmap shows us the urgency of shifting our advocacy efforts, but there's no magic tool, no. So we will have areas that are harder than others to advance. The advocacy roadmap is available at this link. It's in English for now, but it's coming in the next week or so in French and in Spanish. And we are having an number of conversations with different communities around the advocacy roadmap and how they want to be engaged in different areas. The key one that I'll flag for those of you who are interested is that tomorrow, with the communities delegation, the developing NGOs and developed NGOs delegation to the board, we're having a webinar that will really do a deep dive on objectives 1 and 4 of the roadmap. So looking at the leadership and funding for civil society, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what the commitments are and how we can leverage those. And then objective 4, which is diplomatic voice. So how do we work with the Global Fund to make sure that they are standing with communities when it comes to human rights, gender equality, and equity? Let me stop there and hand it back to you, Katie. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. I'm having some technical difficulties where I'm speaking from today, so I'm like holding my laptop near somewhere that I can plug it in. So apologies. The webinar tomorrow, I'm going to try and pop in the information to register for it and the details. But if there's anybody from one of the delegations who has it quickly on hand, please do go ahead, as the intention is to do a bit more of a deep dive. Translation will be available, and it's the delegation colleagues as well as I said, I think it's colleagues from Kyrgyzstan and Uganda who are also going to be online to share their reflections around the roadmap. So thank you, Claudia, for walking us through the roadmap and all of the different elements and the early thoughts anyways around sort of accountability and how to use the advocacy roadmap. I see hands are already raised. I think Peter had raised his hand about 5 or 6 minutes ago. So he's clearly going to go back to something about mid-presentation perhaps, but we've got hands raised, and I would just invite everyone else to please raise your hands if you have something that you would like to jump in on, or use the chat for some of those questions. And I'll try to resolve my sort of technical challenge here and get that registration information for you into the chat. So Peter, first to you, and then Asia, and then we'll go back to you, Claudia, to reflect on their comments or questions. Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Claudia, for the wonderful presentation. And it was not 10 minutes ago, maybe 5 minutes. But you all remember we talked about, or you talked about the diplomatic voice, and I had the same questions as you probably had. You know, what is diplomatic voice? I never could figure it out. You mentioned the number 31. This probably relates to the days a month might have, possibly. But anyway. For me, the diplomatic voice sort of resembles the idea that the Global Fund could become a little bit more political and really try to sort of use its power it has. And I know this is tricky, and I know that discussions are needed to sort of work on that. I just wonder, in terms of, because you have this memorandum of understanding with UNAIDS, and UNAIDS has country offices, and UNAIDS has this really sort of broad portfolio to work on shrinking spaces and all these issues. So how is this discussed within the Global Fund? Is there any idea to sort of cooperate a bit closer with UNAIDS? Is this discussed? Because they might be the perfect partners to sort of give the diplomatic voice of the Global Fund a voice, or a standing, or whatever you want to call it. And sorry, I don't want to insult anyone, but I think that there is some space for collaboration that could be used, and that is not used at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Asia, can you go ahead?
Sure. Thanks, Claudia, for presenting the material. Asia Russell from Health Gap. So I have 2 questions. I think the reality is, just speaking among friends, that in many country contexts and global contexts, the Global Fund's diplomatic voice sounds more like a squeak, frankly. And we're not just talking about voice, we're talking about power and leverage. And the way to respond in a rollback is to fight back. Otherwise, we get more of the same and worse. And you could actually associate perhaps the lessening of the diplomatic voice with the rollback, because governments and other duty bearers become emboldened in a time when they feel like they can get away with it. So what's the deliverable there around the diplomatic voice? I missed that. I think communities we collaborate with over the years have also seen such a long delay between requests to the Secretariat, requests to grant management, that diplomatic power be deployed, and any sort of action at all. So is there a timeliness measure? Is there, like, just what's the outcome beyond the very good intention, which we know we all share? And then my second point is about making these ideas in the roadmap come alive in the silo of grant management in the Global Fund. And again, I think that's where we see communities really desperate to get Global Fund grants to have more impact and better outcomes, particularly when less accountable governments are the main recipients of funding. And yet there is not an equal seat at the table when it comes to very powerful and political dynamics around grant making and grant finalization. So how are you going to hold grant management accountable to these deliverables, since I think we often see advocacy understood by different actors at the Global Fund as sort of soft and nice, and really just about resource mobilization and not as a non-negotiable component of the Global Fund? Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Asia. Thanks, Peter. Let me start with Peter on UNAIDS. We have started to collaborate more with them around the diplomatic voice piece, particularly with the violations of human rights in Uganda, but then also looking at how that is gaining very terrifying momentum in across Africa and other regions. So we're doing that. I think a lot more can still be done, but it's a start. Asia, let me take your questions in different orders, but essentially you ended by saying there's kind of different understandings of advocacy across the Global Fund, and it's something kind of soft and nice. I think you're right, unfortunately. And that in a way was what was so powerful about developing the roadmap, because we did it with teams across the Secretariat. So it gave us a platform to have some of these discussions that we hadn't had before, and to make clear that the advocacy priorities of the Global Fund cannot simply be around replenishment and mobilizing resources, no, especially in the face of these massive rollbacks of rights. It will, of course, I think it's a much longer term kind of mind shift change, let me call it that, across different teams to make sure that it actually happens. But we are putting in place an advocacy roadmap kind of tracking tool internally that shows kind of who's responsible for what, and then we'll have regular meetings with the different kind of action leaders to make sure that progress is being made. And then if it's not, when we do our reviews and we discuss with civil society and partners, we'll be very honest about that. Some areas I think will be hard, and the diplomatic voice is one of them, unfortunately. Then an action that I didn't mention before, but I think is important for everyone to be aware of, is data that we've committed to make externally available in the advocacy roadmap around how much of the funding from Grant Cycle 7 actually goes to civil society and communities. And this is something that partners have been asking, at least for the 2 years I've been at the Global Fund, they've been asking for it, where they say, essentially, to characterize it, we do all this stuff to advocate for the Global Fund, we stand with you at replenishment, we speak to the value, we help you mobilize resources. Does the money you raise actually reach communities and civil society? And we've never had a proper answer to that. So the commitment in the roadmap is to get the data and share it. I can already tell you that the broad numbers from Grant Cycle 6 is around 30%. Around 30% of the country grant funding would go to civil society and communities. What we don't have is the breakdown of that. How much of that is actually grassroots organizations? How much of it is key populations and those working on women's rights? How much of it is youth? versus, for example, how much of it is in big international organizations. We don't know that. My hope, and this is why I really asked you all to use this as an accountability tool, is that once we go kind of public with the 30%, you can ask those questions and give a little push for the Secretariat to get that data, because it's not easily done, but it can't be impossible, no? Then on the diplomatic voice, what can I say? That's why I say the objective 4, it's minimum standards. The actions, the deliverables there are around, there's a commitment to publicly speak to the values of the Global Fund, so the values in support of human rights and so on. There's a commitment to consult and meaningfully engage with communities on the ground that are being affected by the different human rights violations. And there's a commitment to report on what actions the Global Fund is taking. It's a start. It's more than we've necessarily have before. Could it be stronger? Absolutely. And my hope again is that this will be the start to push that work a little bit further, because even getting to that was hard, to be frank. Let me stop there and hand it back to see if there are any other questions or reflections.
Thanks, Claudia. I'm not seeing any other hands raised, but oh, there's one now. But I think one of the things that I would just sort of ask you to contemplate, and when you answer, is what role there is around this advocacy roadmap with the board. Like you say that there's going to be an annual sort of report, there's going to be, there's going to be annual meetings. Is this going to be reflected? Does this help contribute towards, the resource mobilization report on an annual basis, or something else? Like, where's the visibility for the rest of the board outside of the delegations from NGOs and communities that sort of understand this deeply? So just maybe incorporate that into your response, and I'll pass it over to Mike, who has his hand raised, and just encourage everyone, if you do have a question, pop it in the chat or raise your hand if you can. Thank you. Mike?
Thanks, Katie, and huge thanks, Claudia, for your presentation and for all the team's work on this roadmap. I think it's great to really sort of be starting and having this discussion around the crucial role that the Global Fund should be playing in terms of really strengthening its voice on the crucial areas of work, particularly around civil society and communities' role in the responses within health, and also on human rights, on gender equality, etc. So great, and looking forward to engaging more on it. I guess just linking back to obviously sort of the work on the principles, just wanted to sort of and it may be already in there, is really sort of the extent to which, particularly in the broader context where, there's a Global Fund Board governance assessment happening next year, I think. There's, new institutions, hopefully no new ones being created, but there've been a recent rash of those with the pandemic fund, etc., as well as like processes like the Future of Global Health Initiatives, where there's a lot of discussion around what sort of, greater sort of centralized or sort of coordination at national level might look like, and sort of, in terms of sort of governance across health that might be government-led, and sort of ensuring that the positive lessons of like the involvement of civil society and communities in global governance, but also at national level through CCMs, etc., that those are being captured, shared and discussed at the global level with other GHIs, but also at the national level. So that was just sort of a question around that. And I just wanted to reinforce a point I think that Peter also sort of made around the UNAIDS, working at national level. They have national offices, and they have those relationships. And I think the fact that the Global Fund doesn't have offices at national level, I think the crucial partnership and sort of thinking around, what meaningfully that partnership needs to look like to both support those, UNAIDS is under a bit of pressure. So I think the Global Fund is really showing and supporting that institution and others like them that can sort of do that work at the ground would be important. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Katie and Mike. On the board reporting, we mentioned in the report to the Audit and Finance Committee that when we started developing the roadmap, we said we're doing this, and it went to the Audit and Finance Committee. because it was part of a resource mobilization update. At the meeting that they had last week, the whole roadmap went to them, but it went as an annex. So not hugely visible, not a dedicated discussion. I think there is room to do there. And the webinar tomorrow with the civil society and communities delegations, I think will be a good start, because in some ways this is something that delegations can push for more than sometimes we can within the Secretariat. Then Mike, you mentioned the CCMs, and I do want to say that one of the bodies or areas of focus that we did not at all include in this roadmap are the CCMs. Even though we are aware that there are many issues around civil society's meaningful engagement within the CCMs. And we went back and forth at the beginning about whether or not to include it, and then decided not to for two reasons. One, because there is this whole CCM evolution project happening independently. So there's a process that will seek to address some of those gaps. And then secondly, I really did not want to include things in the advocacy roadmap that I do not have confidence that we can affect. And that's simply because of where the political and civil society advocacy team within the Global Fund sits. Realistically, can we influence the CCM functioning and evolution from my team? I don't think so. Everything else that's in the roadmap, yes, I think we can. We're not necessarily the leads on all of it, but we can influence, we can work with the different teams, we can push things in the right directions, but CCMs are not in there at all. Then on the global level kind of coordination and discussions with different global health institutions, we're trying to do a lot more of that, and the advocacy roadmap does have actions around that, where the Global Fund would be much more vocal around the added value, for example, of having communities and civil society on our board, on having consultative processes for different key issues, so that we are putting it forward as a positive experience, and then also being stronger in saying, if you want the Global Fund to kind of engage in the space, for example, thinking of the experience with Act A, then this is a requirement for us. So that's where we are with that. I think we're in a good space when it comes to the coordination, though of course it's always a matter of sustaining it, no? Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Claudia. I think that's really helpful. And I think we all appreciate sort of starting the discussions today. I think, you know, it is always the case that when we do the first thing that we've kind of been waiting for and known has been needed for a really long time, that we have a lot of, okay, but what next, what next, what next? And I think that, you know, I think there's some obvious places, but I think, you know, we would really like to find ways from within the GFAN family to help give this more profile and help develop it into something that's more, you know, not more rigorous. I shouldn't say that, because it's not that it isn't, but you know, like that has some rigor, and that it is, you know, in front of the people who are making decisions, and also in front of the people who are making decisions about who's engaged at the CCM level, or who's engaged at the national level, or who's engaged within donor country delegations, you know, and donor country government conversations about this, and so on. So I think it's, you know, a helpful starting point. I think there's a lot of what next, can we do this, can we do this? But we'll just keep those avenues of communication open with you as always, Claudia, and you can expect us to be, you know, possibly pushing and trying to hold the Secretariat to account, but really thank you for the effort that you've taken to get this first step in this process that I think a number of us have, you know, had wanted for a long time. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. And just a reminder to everyone that there is this second kind of more in-depth conversation tomorrow on the roadmap and some of the more specifics. And if you'd like to join, we've shared the information in the chat. It's being hosted by the delegations to the Global Fund Board, the communities, and 2 NGO delegations to the Global Fund Board. So join us again tomorrow. Looking forward to it and talking to it. Thank you, Claudia. And I'm just going to pass it back to Conte. Unless, Claudia, you had anything final you wanted to say, but otherwise I'm passing it back to Conte for some final announcements.
Just to say, in terms of next steps, we are developing one-pagers on the roadmap, because some of the feedback that we've gotten is that 30 pages is still a lot. So we'll do kind of a 1-pager per objective, and we'll circulate those on the GFAN listserv once they're available. Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead, Conte.
Thanks a lot, Claudia. So just to close up with the calls, I had a few final announcements. I'm just sorry, I'm having a bit of a technical nightmare tonight. So I'm posting a few links in the chat. So first, I want to cover the topic of the next few calls. So our next call will be on November 1st. We'll have World AIDS Day look ahead, and we'll talk about the upcoming issues at the next Global Fund board meeting. We will not have a call on November 15th. It's still in your calendars, but not for very long, because it falls during the board meeting and the team will be there. So our next call after that will be on November 29th, and we'll debrief the Global Fund board meeting. Very board meeting focused for the next month. And I wanted to flag an ongoing call for signature. We have a red line open letter on the Future of Global Health Initiative open letter that is up on our website. There's a link in the chat. And if you want more context on the GHI report, we have put out a statement and a blog recently that you can read and enjoy again on our website, and the links are in the chat. I think that is it in terms of announcements. Back to you, Kate.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for highlighting those and popping the links into the chat. So I'm not seeing any other questions or comments that I think need addressing today in the chat, although somebody has just popped one in. And I think that they're standing behind me. But thank you, Mike, for more commentary there. But as we said, this is an ongoing conversation, and we'll look forward to welcoming Claudia and her colleagues back to various calls to continue to explore the roadmap and how it can be improved and reported upon and those kinds of things. So thank you. And thanks to everybody. I hope you have a good rest of your days. And again, join us tomorrow when the delegations are hosting a call that'll go a bit more deep dive into some of these issues as it relates to the advocacy roadmap. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your days. Take good care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Quentin. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye.